Okay, my friends, it is Wednesday, February 26, 2025. I have 10 big stories for you today. So, we're going to start in an odd place. This is the U.S. National Debt Clock at usdebtclock.org, and it's 36 trillion US dollars. I remember when we were talking about how outrageous it was that we were at $6 trillion, and this was like a decade, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. How terrible this is that we're saddling our children with that. Okay, well, with that in mind, we now have the Doge clock on here, and that's 140 billion dollars coming back the right direction, like from the cuts. Now, there's conflicting demands, and the Doge team is cutting. Now, they're cutting with a sledgehammer rather than surgically, but that is to recover some of this money from both the budget and the debt. And so that's what's going on here with the Doge clock. Now, with that in mind, you have things that are going maybe off the rails, like U.S. withdrawal from Syria risks reversing hard-earned gains that the U.S. has made against ISIS. The current presence in Syria now faces a few threats, and it keeps ISIS contained. Now faces few threats and keeps ISIS contained. A withdrawal now would risk ISIS's reconstitution, but you have conflicting demands. So you have this demand to drive down the amount of debt or amount of how much is spoken for within our budget, and then you have things like, well, ISIS. And so that's a good way of framing what we're about to see, because it affects a lot of those things like USAID and other things. Okay, next big story, second big story. U.S. breaks with allies, declines to sign WTO, that's World Trade Organization statement condemning Russian aggression. 44 WTO members signed a statement condemning Russia's impact on Ukraine, while the United States notably abstained for the first time. This isn't a good trend, with the United States abstaining from a statement like this. And you had the UN statement the other day with the same kind of thing. The U.S. is on the wrong side of this. What's going on? Okay, so the United States abstained from signing a statement at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, that condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine. Reuters reported on 26 February. Quote, the decision not to co-sponsor was made in keeping with our position in the United Nations Security Council and UN General Assembly earlier this week, a U.S. official told Reuters. 44 WTO members and Ukraine signed the statement, including the European Union, Britain, Canada, and Australia. The statement expresses concern about Russia's actions. So what was in it? What was so terrible about this? Quote, this is the statement. We are gravely concerned about the consequences of the destruction for Ukraine and for global trade. Wow. There's not anything terrible about that. The diplomatic shift comes shortly after the United Nations Security Council adopted a U.S. drafted resolution on 24 February that took a neutral position on the Russian war in Ukraine. This is all bad that the shift is going this direction. Reuters describes this as reflecting the dramatic change in Washington's position since President Donald Trump took office in January. And Ukraine's allies fear a hasty resolution could come at the expense of its national interest. I would be worried about that too, were I sitting in Ukraine. Okay, next big story. Trump says Zelensky will come to the U.S. on 28 February to sign a subsoil deal. That's the rare earths deal. Donald Trump declared Tuesday that, quote, everything is going very well with Russia and Ukraine ahead of Ukrainian President Zelensky's confirmed visit to the U.S. Now, what are we talking about? So there's rare earth minerals. See this in purple here on this. That's very important to the U.S., as well as some other things that are over here, non-ferrous metals, and in the blue we have polymetallic, and so there's some of these things that are in occupied areas. There's some that's in other places within Ukraine. Now, the U.S. Officials want to get their hands on it, but the deal that they had before, man, that was terrible. I was embarrassed looking at that deal, like what Trump put forward with no security deals. Like, it was just completely one-sided, gave him very little time to think about signing it. Zelensky snubbed that deal, and then Trump lashed out at Zelensky as a consequence. This is how Trump tends to do his negotiations. So Zelensky plans to sign a very big deal. This is according to Trump, Previously, Kyiv rejected a draft deal as the U.S. demanded access to $500 billion worth of natural resources without offering sufficient support. European allies are concerned about this rapprochement with Moscow and potential concessions to Russia. Let's hear what Trump has to say here.
I hear that. I hear that he's coming on Friday. Certainly, it's okay with me if he'd like to. And he would like to sign it together with me. And I understand that's a big deal, very big deal. And I think the American people, even if you look at polling, they're very happy because, Biden was throwing money around like it's cotton candy. And it's a very big deal. It could be $1 trillion deal. It could be whatever. But it's rare earths and other things. Shouldn't have had this problem because it shouldn't have happened, but it did happen. So we have to straighten it out. But the American taxpayer now is going to get their money back plus. But you're going to need some form of peacekeeping. So something will be done that's going to be satisfactory to everybody. We need peacekeeping too.
Any situation
it's actually something I did discuss, but a form of peacekeeping that's acceptable to everybody. Ultimately, we'll be able to agree on something.
Okay, we'll come back to the peacekeeping thing later, but the first deal was absolutely terrible. This deal doesn't look that bad. Okay, Keith Kellogg was here meeting with Zelensky the other day. Keith Kellogg's the most pro-Ukraine figure within Trump's circles, and he was fairly enthusiastic about supporting Zelensky. We'll see how this all plays out, but here, Ukraine and U.S. agree on economic deal, including rare earth materials, Ukrainian officials say. Ukraine and the U.S. have reached an agreement on framework for broad economic deal that would include access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, the three senior Ukrainian officials said on Tuesday. According to one official, some technical details are still to be worked out. However, the draft does not include the contentious Trump administration proposal to give the U.S. $500 billion worth of profits from Ukraine's rare earth minerals as compensation for its wartime assistance to Kyiv. Instead, the U.S. and Ukraine would have joint ownership of a fund, and Ukraine would in the future contribute 50% of future proceeds from state-owned resources, including minerals, oil, and gas. One official said the deal had better terms of investment, and another said that Kyiv secured favorable amendments and viewed the outcome as positive. The deal does not, however, include security guarantees. But the hope is that it gets the U.S. so interested or so involved that it's really going to be a buffer against allowing Russia to do what Russia has done. The two sides made significant progress during a 3-day visit to Ukraine last week by retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. So that's where we are right now. It's not everything you were hoping for. It's not everything I was hoping for. And that first one was just freaking embarrassing. Like, that first deal was just obnoxious. Okay. Boris Johnson supports the U.S.-Ukraine mineral agreement. It's extortion, he says, but there are positive aspects. According to him, signing the document is the only way to move forward in ending the war. The former British PM noted that he had seen an updated draft of the agreement. Now, I have not. I'm just going by what has been reported. Which now allegedly obliges the United States to support a free, sovereign, and secure Ukraine. Now, if that's what it actually does, that's good. Even if it doesn't do other things that we would like it to do, if it causes that, that's positive. Quote, I look at this document and see positive things for Ukraine. I think it contains seeds of hope and progress. Okay, so we're not exactly sure what that is, but at the same time, the Kremlin is now talking about its own rare earth minerals deal. Now, they're trying to get into the act here. The Kremlin is framing, this is the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. The Kremlin is framing any future U.S.-Russian cooperation on rare earth minerals as conditional on the conclusion of a Russian-friendly peace deal on the war in Ukraine. So they're coming up with their own version of that. They've got plenty of land. They've got rare earth minerals somewhere tucked away. And they also have the occupied land that is Ukraine right now. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov stated on February 25th that any U.S.-Russian cooperation on rare earth minerals can only begin after normalizing bilateral relations and achieving a peace settlement in Ukraine. Russian officials used economic benefits that are unrelated to the war in Ukraine in return for Ukrainian and Western concessions. So they're trying to bribe their way out of this, which is really interesting to watch. The ISW continues to assess that American acceptance of these Russian-offered economic measures without demanding any Russian concessions on Ukraine in return would give away the leverage that the United States will need to achieve Trump's stated objectives of achieving a lasting and enduring peace and the benefits that the benefits to both the United States and Ukraine. Yeah, they have to be really careful with this kind of deal. Okay, cost of U.S. aid to Ukraine. This is the next big story. It's half of the official estimates, according to some economists. They're saying that's actually only 18.3 billion as opposed to 60 billion declared by Washington. Now, the way that they get there is really interesting. Here it is, Kirilo Shevchenko. He is the former chief of the National Bank of Ukraine, echoing this. The cost is 18.3 as opposed to 60, a new study finds. And when we go to the actual study, we find some interesting things here like, okay, so the aid turned out to be significantly lower than the stated figure for a couple of reasons. The actual value of weapons and equipment sent to Ukraine is about 60% lower than what they're officially priced at because of age and limited combat effectiveness. So think about that kind of like depreciation, right? You have a car, but it's not worth the $30,000 that it is because you had it for some years. It's now really worth, I don't know, 17,000, let's say, right? It's that sort of thing. Okay, a significant portion of equipment transfers have yet to occur. So not all the resources have got there. That's another thing. But just take this one. A substantial portion, approximately 25% of the military aid was actually loans, not grants. Okay, and so if that's the case, then 65.9 actually turns out to be 494. So it's 49, 425. So it's less than 50 million rather than 65. So just that alone from the loan. So, and you chip away and chip away and chip away. These economists are from UC Berkeley, Stockholm School of Economics, and a number of other good schools. Okay, is there something there? Yes, but they account for it this way, even if it's real. Like I don't know what they're trying to achieve, except to kind of knock out the idea that we've given 350 billion. I mean, whatever Trump has in his head, he has in his head, and that's not this. This isn't going to change that. But I saw this and I thought, why? Okay, so according to the report, support from the United States for Ukraine can be split into the following categories, like direct funding through international and institutional accounts. The U.S. provided almost $31 billion through the World Bank accounts managed by USAID contractors, and this was used to reimburse verified expenses, pensions, teacher salaries, healthcare. I don't know why we're in that business. Everything that should come from the U.S. should be military aid because we have the military aid that Europe just doesn't have. So to ask for this as opposed to military aid, just focus on military aid or acquiring the military aid from the U.S. There's loans, there's all kinds of things, direct equipment transfers, and the President Drawdown Authority has sent approximately $31 billion of equipment and munitions drawn from existing stockpiles. But the way that they say that it should be valued at less than half of what is quoted at $12.5 billion. Yes, but you'd still depreciate things, but you can't get it somewhere else. So it's not like a car that might have been depreciated because to get an actual one of these things, you can't really get it. I mean, like maybe they're marking it at market value of a tank. What is that? Is it depreciated because it's older, or can you actually go out in the open market and buy the tank? So I wouldn't worry about this. I saw this and Lend-Lease was expired or unused. That may kick back into gear. And I would, if I were a betting man, I would say Lend-Lease will come back. Okay, at any rate, that's where we are with that. Next big story, Garry Kasparov was talking about 5 days. I joked about Trump sending weapons to Russia instead of Ukraine. Today, Joke Jr. actually suggested it. Stupidity always outstrips irony. And he was talking about this, where he said, Trump to the rescue to lift sanctions just in time to keep funding Russia's war on Ukraine. The one Trump says he wants to end. Perhaps the U.S. will also start sending weapons to Russia. He was just joking about that. There are plenty of sitting around that Biden promised but never sent to Ukraine. Okay, and that's a reply to this. Putin's war economy has painted him into a corner, making it impossible for him to back down. I think that's very fair, and I think that's really important to understand. Like, the Russians are talking about peace, but they can't actually do that because they have to achieve more and hold on to stuff, or they can't just stop. His continued grip on power is now fully dependent on his ability to bankroll arms production and pay his troops. think that's right. Now, Trump simultaneously, next big story, is openly saying that Ukraine can forget about NATO, and he accurately points out that's probably the reason the whole thing got started. Ooh, accurately pointed that out. That's not what's going on. This is from Clandestine, which is a somebody who posts things that Marjorie Taylor Greene actually says or repeats very often. It's not accurately pointing out that's probably the reason it got started. It's inaccurately pointing that out. Okay, so here's what Trump actually said.
Our equipment, that would have been over very quickly.
What concessions would you like to see? What concessions would you like to see?
Oh, I don't want to tell right now, but I can tell you that NATO you can forget about. I think that's probably the reason the whole thing started.
Wow, I really wish his advisors had a very different frame of reference because he thinks like NATO caused this. Okay, so it wasn't NATO that caused this. And here's J.D. Vance kind of with the same kind of misguided understanding saying during my Senate campaign in 2022, I met a Ukrainian American man in Northeast Ohio. He was very angry about my views of the conflict and my desire to bring it to a rapid close. Quote, "You're trying to abandon my country and I don't like it." He said, "Sir," I replied, "your country is the United States of America, and so is mine. I always found it offensive that new immigrant to our country would be willing to use the power and influence of their new nation to settle the ethnic rivalries of the old." Okay, so I kind of was tracking with him until he said to settle the ethnic rivalries of the old, because it's not just that. Like if you limit it to that sort of thing, then I understand why Vance would be thinking like that. But it's not that. It's that an authoritarian neighbor is attacking a democracy, and we're like the pro-democracy crowd here, right? Aren't we? And we're like all about international rules being upheld. Like that's a kind of a good thing. So he goes on and finishes, "The right question is what's in the best interest of the United States. But upholding the rule of law, the international order, is actually in the long-term interest of the United States, because if it collapses here, it could collapse elsewhere. What's to stop China from saying, you know what?" And then we have a whole different problem set. Okay, Trump said that in Ukraine, it will be necessary to agree on a format for a peacekeeping mission that would be acceptable to each side. And then you see this. He had previously stated that Putin would not oppose European peacekeepers in Ukraine as part of a potential ceasefire. A journalist, however, noted that the Kremlin had stated that a mission format that would include military personnel from European countries was unacceptable. His reply was, "That's not what I was told." And yeah, so that's where we are. Here's Lavrov talking about. Lavrov said Russia hadn't agreed to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine and there would be no ceasefire along the current combat line. Now, this is why I said I think Russia understands that it has to keep going. And so I don't perceive any peace deal coming anytime soon unless it can be along elaborately pro-Russian terms, and I just don't see that actually happening. Okay, Lavrov, Russia is directly contradicting the initiative and the statements of the U.S. president about a ceasefire and peacekeeping in Ukraine. So if they do that and they cross him and they do that in a severe way where he looks bad, I think Trump may very well slap back the other direction, but that's yet to be determined or yet to be seen. Can this be called Russia wanting peace and ready to negotiate? And can constant concessions to Russia be called negotiations? Well, I don't think so. But this is where Lavrov is. Now, this is another big story, Putin attempted to use new language to repackage the calls for regime change in Ukraine that he demanded since 2021. Putin implicitly acknowledged that Zelensky is the legitimate president of Ukraine and Russia's future negotiating partner, while promoting a new information operation that aims to destabilize Ukrainian society. So Putin's changing his rhetoric about Zelensky. What Putin really wants at the end of the day is to sow discord in Ukraine so that he can get a new president that's more to his liking. What he really wants is a puppet. Jay and Kiev talks about how Putin says that he intends to change out Ukraine's leadership. No, now that's what he really wants, because if you just had a Ukraine that was willing to just be in Russia's orbit and be Russia's vassal state, none of this would have ever happened. That's what would have prevented this war. But that's not what Ukrainians wanted. They wanted to be free from Russia. Now, I just put it into Grok and I asked, list all the reasons Russia has given for invading Ukraine. And all of these ring true to me. Denazification of Ukraine. They use that. That's not really true. There was no Nazis. Well, like, show me the Nazis. That like certainly after 3 years, you found the Nazis, right? No. Okay. Demilitarization of Ukraine, a close cousin of that. Preventing NATO expansion. That sounds to be legitimate until you actually look at it and what's going on and why these countries are going away. And if that was your goal, then you should have been writhing in agony about Finland and Sweden. Protecting Russian-speaking populations. You know how many Ukrainians that are Russian-speaking that you've actually killed over this time, or how many you're drawing into your forces and sending them into battle against their fellow Ukrainians. So it's not that at all. Russian recognizing and supporting separatist regions, well, they're doing that already. Countering alleged genocide in Donbass, that was made up. Historical unity and denying Ukrainian statehood. Yeah, I mean, there is historical unity of making Ukraine a vassal state. That's the way that they think about it. Defending Russia's security against Western threats. They don't need it. The West wasn't threatening them until they invaded Ukraine. Stopping Ukraine from acquiring nuclear weapons. They weren't interested in that before. Restoring Russia's imperial greatness. Okay, there we are. That's what they're trying to do. While not always explicitly stated, Putin's rhetoric often implies a broader ambition to restore Russia's historical influence over former Soviet territories. That is what's going on. Russia responding to alleged Ukrainian provocations. Anything they say can be a provocation. They make things up that are not provocations and turn it into something. And then eliminating a Western puppet regime. But the puppet regime was really the Ukrainian state before the 2004 and then again later on, where they, as Ukraine looked to the West, Putin didn't like it and couldn't stand it. And that's really where we are. Okay, just a couple last things. We want the ceasefire to be guaranteed, says the French finance minister, Eric Lombard, guaranteed by European countries with an American backup. And there's a general agreement that in order to guarantee the ceasefire, it will be necessary to have European troops in the Ukraine. But again, Lavrov is not agreeing to that. Trump is saying that they're agreeing to something that they're not agreeing to. Okay, just another weird story before I get to the last thing. The pro-Russian Romanian presidential candidate that came from nowhere just 4 months ago, praising the Nazi-allied 1930s era Iron Guard, believing that part of Ukraine belongs to Romania, and with the support of Elon Musk, is slated to take the Romanian presidency. Georgescu is polling at 40%. This was a fieldwork for 21 to 24 February 2025, sample size of about 3,000. So if they did the poll right, that's a legitimate sample, size for a poll, and that's kind of scary, right? I mean, it really is. Jane Keefe talks about how finally one Western nation is acting to root out Russian interference. Nationwide police raids in Romania this morning as investigations into pro-Russian candidate Gergescu reveal what we all know. Another puppet of the Putin regime. There was $10 million in cash at his bodyguard's house. Trips back and forth to Moscow, all the usual. And this is like bricks of just U.S. dollars in saran wrap. It's just like, yeah. So that's what we found. Okay, last big story. I wanted to point out what is good articles, like good solid articles, and what's not. So the things I've gone through were generally good solid articles. Here's one that's not so good, and I'll tell you why. Even though it comes from a good source, this is UATV. I have nothing against UATV. I've been on it, but just be careful with the source, not the source, the way it's written. Trump rules out lifting sanctions on Russia for now, but doesn't exclude it in the future. Well, of course he doesn't exclude it in the future. Eventually, sanctions will come off, assuming that Russia plays nice, or they are beaten and they have to, submit to some things, and then eventually, or sanctions will be lifted, or whatever the deal is. Eventually, sanctions will go away. But this sounds more ominous than it has to, so be careful with that sort of thing. Donald Trump stated that the lifting of sanctions on Russia is not being considered at the moment, but admitted that such a possibility could arise in the future. Well, duh. Of course it will rise in the future somewhere, put the timeline out far enough. Sure, it'll arise. Okay, so just be careful with that kind of headline because it sounds more ominous than it needs to be. But this one I think is bad. I have nothing against the source in this case either, but just let's listen to this. Trump may demand the exclusion of Finland and Sweden from NATO in the interest of an agreement with the Kremlin, Finnish political scientist had said. Okay, so just because one guy says something doesn't mean it's going to happen. And when you say he may do something, just be careful with that. It's much more sound to say, hey, this has happened, and say, right? And the what is always easier to make sure that you understand than the why it's happened. But yeah, I mean, this okay, you get my point. All right, last little thing. Somebody sent me this. Let's see, Go Hib New is the source of this on Blue Sky. Laugh out loud. Morning Doc. Even on Gilligan's Island, they listen to the professor, not the millionaire. Okay. Well, all right. I like the sound of that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.